Spring 2026. A Los Angeles-class attack submarine transited the Bering Strait, turned north, and went under the ice. No press release followed. No fleet public affairs officer confirmed the departure. The boat ran silent for 41 days along the Chukchi Shelf, north of an island most people could not place on a map. When it surfaced, it brought back something no satellite pass and no surface ship could have collected: the acoustic fingerprints of Russian Yasen-M submarines transiting east. That is the move. The island is Wrangel. The question is why a late Block 688 ran 41 days of under-ice station keeping in one of the most operationally demanding environments on the planet, and why the Pacific Fleet needed that data badly enough to spend the whole time. The answer is not about the Arctic. It is about the Pacific approach corridors that no one was watching closely enough, and the acoustic library gap that a future conflict could not afford to leave open. The submarine did not go north to threaten Russia. It went north to listen, and the audience for everything it recorded was not Moscow. The audience was a team of Pacific Fleet analysts at Pearl Harbor who will inherit that recording and use it to track the next Yasen-M transit from the first hour of contact instead of spending a week trying to build a baseline from scratch. The patrol was a data collection run. The strategic geography around it explains why that data had become urgent. The periscope breaks the surface for a single sweep, horizon to horizon, open ocean, nothing on the radar scope but distance. Below the waterline, the attack boat holds its depth and holds its course, pushing northeast through the Chukchi approaches. This is the northeastern corner of Russia's northern sea route, the corridor any Russian submarine transiting eastbound must pass before it clears into the Pacific. The geometry is tight: Russian sovereign territory to port, the Alaskan coastline a long run to the east, the Bering Strait behind them. The MH-60 Seahawk that lifted off the carrier deck hours ago is already back aboard. From here, the monitoring is the submarine's work alone. That corridor has become significantly more active since 2022. Russia's Northern Fleet, which homeports the bulk of its nuclear-powered attack submarines at Gadjievo and Polyarny on the Kola Peninsula, has been incrementally repositioning assets to the Pacific. The logic is straightforward. The Northern Fleet's operating theater in the Atlantic and the Norwegian Sea has become acoustically crowded and heavily monitored by NATO forces. Norwegian P-8A patrols out of Andoya, and a network of fixed and mobile underwater sensors that has been in place since the Cold War. Moving submarines east into the Pacific opens a second strategic front where the U.S. acoustic baseline is thinner and where the distances from Allied shore-based patrol aircraft are considerably longer. The Severodvinsk class, designated Yasen-M in its production variant, is Russia's most capable nuclear-powered attack submarine. 4 hulls are currently commissioned: Kazan, Novosibirsk, Krasnoyarsk, and Arkhangelsk. A 5th, Perm, is in late-stage fitting out at the Sevmash yard in Severodvinsk. The Yasen-M carries Kalibr cruise missiles with a range of roughly 1,500 kilometers in their land attack variant, as well as Onyx anti-ship missiles and, in certain loadouts, Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles. Its acoustic signature is substantially quieter than the older Oscar II and Akula-class boats it is replacing. When one of these submarines enters the Pacific Fleet's ability to track it from first detection depends entirely on having a reference signature on file. Without that baseline, a Yasen-M running quiet in the Deep Sound Channel north of Hawaii or operating in the approaches to Guam is a contact that may take days to classify with confidence. With it, the same contact is identified in hours. The problem, as of early 2026, was that the Pacific Fleet's acoustic library on Yasen-M boats east of the Bering was thin. The class had conducted Northern Fleet patrols in the Barents and the Norwegian Sea for several years, and NATO had accumulated solid reference data from those transits through its Atlantic monitoring network. But the Arctic transit signatures, the acoustic profile of a Yasen-M running under ice, navigating the shallow water acoustic environment of the Chukchi Shelf, and emerging into the Pacific through the Bering approaches, were not well documented. The ice changes everything acoustically. The boundary layer between cold, fresh meltwater and warmer saltwater beneath it creates sound channels that behave differently than open ocean environments. A submarine running under ice generates different flow noise patterns, adjusts its speed and depth profile for ice avoidance, and the acoustic returns reflect differently off the underside of the ice canopy. To identify a Yasen-M in that environment from a distance, you need a reference recording made in that same environment. That is what a late Block 688 went to collect, running quiet under ice, its sonar dome pointed northeast, listening for whatever was transiting the route above. If you want the geometry behind the headline instead of just the headline, subscribe to Blue Water. This is what the channel is built around: the strategic logic that does not make the press release. The Los Angeles class, hull numbers 751 through 7773 in its late block variant, was designed and built primarily for open ocean anti-submarine warfare and, later, for land attack strike with Tomahawk cruise missiles. It is not an ice-capable submarine in the same way that a Seawolf-class or the Virginia-class Block V boats are designed. Late Block 688s carry the BQQ-5E sonar suite and the AN/BPS-15 ice avoidance radar, which gives the crew a degree of situational awareness about ice thickness and keel depth from directly overhead. But operating under Arctic ice in a late Block 688 is operationally demanding in ways that a Barents Sea intelligence collection run is not. The ice canopy limits tactical maneuvering. Emergency surface procedures are constrained by ice coverage. The acoustic environment requires constant adjustment of the ship's own noise management to avoid masking the targets it is there to record, because the same sensitivity that lets the sonar suite hear a distant submarine will also capture any noise generated by the collecting vessel's own machinery spaces, hull resonances, and flow over the sail. The 688 class has been the workhorse of the U.S. attack submarine fleet for over 4 decades. More than 60 boats were built across 3 variants, and the late Block 688I configuration introduced a vertical launch system capable of carrying up to 12 Tomahawk cruise missiles, significantly extending the class's strike utility beyond its original anti-submarine mission. The late Block boats also incorporated improved under-ice capability compared to the original 688s, the BPS-15A upward-looking sonar, modified sail geometry to reduce ice impact damage during emergency surfacing, and reinforced sail structure. Those modifications were not cosmetic. They reflected a deliberate calculation by the Navy that certain mission profiles would require sustained Arctic operations from a hull class that was never originally designed to operate there routinely. The Spring 2026 patrol was exactly the kind of mission that capability investment was designed to enable. Submarine Development Squadron 5, homeported at Naval Base Kitsap, Bangor in Washington State, is the command responsible for advanced submarine development, tactics development, and special missions. DEVRON 5 assets and taskings have historically included acoustic intelligence collection, under-ice operations development, and the validation of new sonar processing techniques against real targets in operationally realistic environments. A 688 class boat operating under a DEVRON 5 tasking in the Arctic is not an anomaly. It is the operational pattern for this kind of collection mission. A hull with a specific sonar configuration, a crew trained for under-ice maneuvering, and a tasking that requires sustained station keeping in a defined geographic box over an extended period. The squadron's mission is to make the fleet better at finding and tracking submarines before the next crisis begins, not during it. 41 days is the operational detail that defines the mission shape. A short transit pass would record a single acoustic snapshot, potentially contaminated by the patrol boat's own noise or by ambient ice noise at a single moment in the operational cycle. 41 days of sustained monitoring along the Chukchi Shelf means the crew was recording the entire acoustic environment of the approach corridor. Ambient background levels, biological noise from the dense marine life of the Chukchi ecosystem, thermal layer variations as the spring melt altered the water column structure from week to week, and, when Russian submarines transited, their complete acoustic signatures across multiple speed and depth profiles. A reference library built from a single pass is a data point. A reference library built from 41 days of sustained observation is a baseline that the fleet can train on, test detection algorithms against, and distribute to every P-8A squadron and every attack submarine crew in the Pacific theater. The question worth asking at this point is why Spring 2026? Specifically, 2 developments converged in the previous 18 months. First, Russia accelerated its Yasen-M Pacific repositioning program after the loss of surface fleet assets in the Black Sea theater created pressure to demonstrate strategic reach through submarine deployments rather than surface presence. Second, and more directly, Novosibirsk conducted a confirmed Pacific transit in late 2024, passing through the Bering Strait and operating in the northwestern Pacific for a period before returning west. That transit was monitored, but the acoustic library built from it was limited by the coverage gaps in the approach corridor north of Wrangel. The Novosibirsk transit demonstrated that the repositioning was not theoretical. It was happening, and it would happen again, with newer, quieter boats, unless the baseline was established now. On the radar scope back aboard the carrier, the marginal ice zone shows as a broken edge shifting north with the season. A winter patrol would have put the boat under consolidated pack ice. A 688 cannot safely work. A summer patrol would have stripped away the ice cover the crew depends on to stay hidden from Russian overhead surveillance. The spring window opens leads and Polony as the submarine can maneuver through while the ice canopy above it complicates any detection from the surface. The sonar display screen logs the contact bearing. Pacific Fleet chose this season, this window, and this boat. And on screen, the deck crew that launched the mission stands down as the carrier island superstructure drops behind the horizon. One detail kept coming back in the analysis of that 224 transit, the approach corridor north of Wrangel, was the segment where coverage was weakest. The Bering Strait itself is well monitored. The open Pacific south of the Aleutian Chain is within range of P-8A Poseidon patrols out of Naval Air Station Whidbey Island in Washington State, NAS Barbers Point in Hawaii, and Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. But the Chukchi Shelf, from the Bering Strait north to the ice edge, is a monitoring gap that geography enforces and operational logistics compound.
Christians are still rapidly complete with venue discussivation cannot be asked. The Bible reduce grants zunker manfolds the next toll that input plus construct PY. Stresses on the cloud and precious gov ritual are the instrument that fills the gap and fills it with the highest quality acoustic data available. Here is the geometry that makes this strategically asymmetric. Russia's Northern Fleet submarines to reach the Pacific and operate in waters relevant to a Taiwan contingency or a Guam targeting scenario must transit the Northern Sea route and pass through a corridor that narrows to roughly 90 kilometers between the Alaskan coast and the Russian Chukotka coast at the Bering Strait proper. Every Yasen-M that enters the Pacific comes through that strait or through the waters immediately north and west of it. That is a single transit corridor with no strategic alternative. One patrol submarine, positioned correctly and with the right acoustic baseline, can track every Russian submarine that moves through it in a given season. Russia cannot replicate that monitoring geometry on the approaches to U.S. Pacific Fleet homeports because there is no equivalent geographic choke point that forces U.S. submarines through a predictable corridor within persistent range of Russian acoustic monitoring assets. A 90-kilometer wide strait, every Russian boat that matters has to go through it. That asymmetry is the whole argument for the patrol.
Spending 41 days building an acoustic library on Yasen-M Arctic transit signatures turns the Bering corridor from a monitoring gap into a knowledge barrier, not a physical barrier. No weapons were positioned. No barrier patrol was established in any combative sense. A knowledge barrier, the kind that means the next Yasen-M that clears the ice edge north of Wrangel is not an unknown contact, requiring days of classification work. It is a tracked contact with a name, a known acoustic profile across multiple operating conditions, and a file that follows it all the way down to its operating area in the Western Pacific. The difference between those two outcomes, in a crisis, is measured in the positioning of carrier strike groups, in the threat assessment that a Pacific Fleet commander uses to decide how close to let a surface group operate to a potential Kalibr launch basket.
What do you think? Does maintaining that kind of acoustic library represent the most important form of undersea competition, or is investment in fixed sensor infrastructure the move that actually changes the calculus long term? That debate is live inside the Pentagon right now, and the budget decisions around it are not settled. The operational challenges of a 41-day under ice patrol in a late block 688 deserve direct treatment because the temptation in geopolitical analysis is to make everything sound clean and frictionless when the operational reality is not. Under ice navigation requires continuous acoustic sensing of the ice canopy overhead. The BPS-15 upward-looking sonar gives the crew ice thickness and keel depth information, but it is not a real-time three-dimensional picture, and pressure ridges can extend to depths of 30 to 50 meters in heavy consolidated pack ice.
Beyond the ice itself, the cold water acoustic environment of the Chukchi creates challenges for the crew's own sonar that do not exist in temperate operating areas. Water temperatures near freezing suppress the thermal gradients that, in warmer oceans, create well-defined sound channels at predictable depths. The Chukchi sound channel is shallower, more variable, and shaped by ice cover in ways that require continuous recalculation of detection geometry. Speed is constrained under ice. A submarine cannot maneuver aggressively to avoid a contact if the ice overhead limits its vertical freedom of movement and creates the risk of a controlled emergency ascent through ice that is too thick to safely penetrate at speed. Emergency surfacing, which in open water is a relatively straightforward evolution, requires identifying a polynya, an area of open water in the ice, or breaking through ice thin enough for the sail to penetrate without structural damage to the boat. In the Chukchi in spring 2026, ice conditions were variable. The seasonal melt had opened leads and polynyas along the shelf, but consolidated pack ice remained north of approximately 73 degrees latitude. The patrol box almost certainly ran along the marginal ice zone, where ice coverage is intermittent and acoustic propagation conditions are most complex and most operationally relevant to the collection tasking. There was a navigation constraint that shaped the entire mission geometry, and that cost the crew significant operational friction over the patrol period. The collection box had to remain far enough north to intercept Russian submarine transits along the Chukchi Shelf route, but south enough to maintain the acoustic propagation conditions necessary for quality recording at useful ranges. Too far north, into consolidated pack ice, and the ambient ice noise itself, the groaning, cracking, and thermal stress of a shifting ice canopy, begins to mask the targets the mission is designed to collect. Too far south, into fully open water, and the mission is no longer intercepting the transit route where acoustic signatures differ most significantly from the open ocean baseline already on file at Pearl Harbor. station keeping in that narrow optimal band for 41 days, while managing the submarine's own acoustic signature to avoid detection by the Russian submarines it was recording. Required sustained discipline from every crew member and continuous adjustment of depth, speed, and course to optimize both collection quality and concealment. The periscope comes down. The boat goes deep. The doctrinal shift underlying this patrol is worth stating plainly, because it reflects a fundamental change in how the United States Navy thinks about its Pacific perimeter and where the critical approach corridors to that perimeter begin. For most of the Cold War and the early post-Cold War period, the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas were understood primarily through an Atlantic strategic lens. They were the northern flank of a theater whose primary axis ran between the Norwegian Sea, the GIUK Gap, and the North Atlantic, and the primary submarine threat was a Soviet ballistic missile submarine attempting to reach a protected operating area under Arctic ice to launch against the continental United States. The missions that went north were mostly about tracking SSBNs, submarines equipped with ballistic missiles, and maintaining awareness of the Bastion doctrine under which Soviet and then Russian strategic submarines sought to operate. That framing has shifted materially in the last 3 years. The Chukchi is now increasingly understood within Pacific Fleet planning as a Pacific approach corridor in its own right. A Yasen-M transiting east is not positioning to launch ballistic missiles from an Arctic bastion. It is transiting toward the western Pacific, where it can threaten carrier strike groups operating in the Philippine Sea, put Guam's military infrastructure inside Kalibr's missile range from a submerged firing position north of the Mariana Islands, and complicate U.S. freedom of maneuver in any Taiwan contingency by forcing strike group commanders to account for a capable hunter-killer submarine operating in their area with an unknown position. The acoustic library this patrol was collecting is not an Atlantic asset, it is a Pacific asset. It will be used by Pacific Fleet analysts, integrated into the acoustic databases maintained at Fleet ASW Command, and distributed to the attack submarines and P-8A Poseidon squadrons that would carry primary ASW responsibility in a Pacific crisis. That reclassification, treating the Chukchi as a Pacific approach rather than an Atlantic northern flank, is the doctrinal shift that the 41-day patrol reflects operationally. It will not appear in any joint publication or naval doctrine document for several years, but it is visible in the mission assignments, in the geography that mission assignments reveal, and in the analytical priorities of Pacific Fleet's ASW community. The second-order consequences of that doctrinal shift are beginning to materialize in force structure decisions visible in the public budget record. The fiscal year 2026 defense budget included increased funding for Arctic sensor infrastructure, an expansion of P-8A basing access in Norway, and line items for underwater acoustic sensor upgrades in the northern Pacific that defense analysts read as targeted at the Bering approach corridor. Those line items do not individually point to the patrol north of Wrangel, but they reflect a planning calculus that treats the Chukchi as a problem requiring systematic investment. The 41-day patrol was both an immediate operational response to the library gap and an argument in the internal budget debate, evidence that the Chukchi approach warrants the fixed infrastructure investment that currently does not exist at the required scale. Russia's response to the U.S. acoustic baselining effort is constrained by the same geography that makes the baselining valuable in the first place. Moscow cannot relocate the Bering Strait. It cannot build a transit corridor that avoids the Chukchi Shelf. What it can do is vary the profiles of future transits, invest in additional acoustic quieting for successive Yasen-M hulls, and potentially route future deployments through the winter ice, when U.S. monitoring assets face greater operational difficulty. None of those counters eliminates the U.S. advantage that the patrol established. Each one imposes cost on Russian transit doctrine. The cost-exchange ratio favors the monitoring effort. Most analysts who follow Russian submarine activity focus on the Barents Sea, on the Norwegian Sea patrols, on the Atlantic transits that the SOSS successor network and NATO P-8 monitoring cover continuously. What does not sit right, looking at the full picture of Russian Pacific repositioning since 2022, is how long the Chukchi approach corridor went without the same systematic acoustic baselining effort that the Atlantic approaches have received for decades. The Novosibirsk transit in 2024 exposed that gap clearly. The spring 2026 patrol was the operational response. The board, as it stands in August 2026, reflects the outcome of that response. Pacific Fleet now has a validated acoustic library on Yasen-M Arctic transit signatures. The next boat that clears the ice edge north of Wrangel will be tracked from first detection. That is a strategic improvement that does not register in any headline, does not appear in any press conference, does not show up in satellite imagery, and generates no diplomatic protest from Moscow. It exists in a file, in a classified acoustic database, and it waits for the contact report that will make it operationally relevant. Will this collection effort remain adequate as Russia continues improving the Yasen-M's acoustic quieting? Comment yes or no. The answer shapes the entire future of Arctic ASW investment. What remains unresolved? Russia is aware that its northern sea route transits are monitored, and the Yasen-M program includes acoustic quieting improvements incorporated into each successive hull based on lessons from previous patrols. Perm, the fifth boat in the class, when it enters service, will reflect lessons from the previous 4 hulls' operating experience in the Pacific rotation. The acoustic library built from monitoring Kazan, Novosibirsk, and Krasnoyarsk during their Arctic transits may require systematic updating as newer hulls enter service with modified machinery and hull-form acoustic profiles. The collection requirement does not end with one 41-day patrol. It becomes a recurring mission demand, conducted periodically as each new hull enters service and as Russia continues its deliberate Pacific repositioning program. There is also the question of Russian counterintelligence against the monitoring effort itself. Moscow knows with confidence that the United States conducts acoustic intelligence collection in the Arctic and in the approaches to the Bering Strait. The degree to which Russia adjusts Yasen-M transit profiles, varying speeds, depths, and acoustic signatures deliberately across successive transits to complicate U.S. reference libraries is not fully resolved by publicly available information. That tactic, known broadly as acoustic deception, has clear precedent in Cold War-era Soviet submarine operations, where boats were known to vary their acoustic signature characteristics during approaches to known monitoring areas. Whether the Yasen-M program has incorporated systematic acoustic deception into its Arctic transit doctrine is a question that the 41-day patrol may have begun to answer, but one that will require continued collection to resolve. Here is what this tells us about the current form of great power competition at sea. The competition is no longer primarily about who can build more hulls, who can deploy more strike groups in a given theater, or who can project more air power from a given island chain. It is increasingly about who has better information about the other side's movements, and who can translate that information advantage into faster, more confident tactical decisions when a crisis begins. The patrol north of Wrangel was not a combat operation. It did not deter anyone in a visible way. It did not demonstrate resolve in a form that makes the evening news. It built a database, and in a conflict scenario where the first hours of undersea detection and classification determine how a carrier strike group is positioned and how much tactical warning exists before a missile engagement opens, a database is a strategic instrument with direct operational consequences. The 41 days under the ice were not spectacular. No surface ship accompanied the patrol. No diplomatic incident followed. No political leader took credit. The crew executed a sustained intelligence collection mission in one of the most operationally demanding environments in the global ocean, and returned to Bangor with data that will have a measurable effect on Pacific Fleet ASW capability for years beyond the patrol's end date. That is the move. That is who it was for. The Pacific Fleet analysts who inherited the recording know what it means. The analysts at Severodvinsk will spend time thinking about what was collected and adjusting accordingly. The carrier sails home. The acoustic library does not.